Today, I'm going to teach you how I brew beer at home using an all-grain system that's fairly easy to set up, not too complicated, and perfect for a spring day. The first steps are clean and sanitize. We'll repeat those first steps over and over and over again today. Got to keep that in mind. So I better get started with cleaning and sanitizing. For cleaning, I'm using PVW. It's an environmentally safe cleaner. I've got about 2 ounces of it for a gallon of water, and I'm going to use it to clean things. Remember, clean and sanitize are not the same thing. Cleaning is removing any dirt, debris, or buildup that happens to be on your brewing equipment. Sanitizing means killing anything living that might be on it. We especially want to be sure we kill off bacteria or yeast. Right now, sanitization isn't a major goal. What we need to worry about first is cleaning. Sanitizing will become much more important later on in the process. So, just scrubbing for now. Now that I've got the kettle clean, I can move on to our next step, which is preparing the strike water. The strike water is hot water that I'll add my grains to when I let it sit. That combination we call the mash, and it's an important step. It's also kind of time consuming. We've got to heat a large amount of water, several different stages. So I'm going to go ahead and fill my kettle with about 11 quarts of water. My recipe calls for about 10.6 quarts, but I'm going to assume there's going to be a little bit of evaporation because the outside air is a lot colder and fairly dry still. These are the grains we're going to use for brewing today. These grains have been malted. Malting a grain is where you take a seed and you allow it to just barely begin the germination process. That's what starts forming and releasing the enzymes that will digest the carbohydrates turned to sugar that we'll need later. They're then ground and processed through a mill. The idea is we want to be able to break open each of the husks so that our enzymes can interact with the carbohydrates inside there, and so that the water can get to it as well. So I've just cleaned a piece of equipment I want to teach you about. It's this guy. This is our mash tun. And it started out just as a 5-gallon igloo cooler. We've made some changes. I've got a heavier duty spigot on here, one that I can attach to a hose. And then in the bottom, I've got a screen built in. There's a small hose leading to the spigot. And this screen will help keep grain from going through. The mash tun is where our grains will sit and steep in hot water at about 153 degrees Fahrenheit. The goal is to get enzymes in the grain to start digesting the carbohydrates into smaller sugars. Those sugars are what the yeast will later digest and turn into alcohol. For now, our big goal is making sugar water. We've got a nice clean mash tun. Our sparge water is at about 170 degrees. When mixed with a slightly colder grain, we should be at about 153 degrees, give or take. We'll try it out. Great, so at this point, we have our water at about 170 degrees, ready to move into the mash tun. That was the container with the little filter at the bottom that'll keep the grains from escaping. I'm double checking to make sure that my valve is closed there. I'm gonna let gravity move the hot water. It's a little safer than me trying to lift it. And I've got this handy valve and a temperature rated hose here. Now as the water moves over, it's going to lose temperature some. We're gonna lose a little bit of our heat energy, but that's okay. We kind of planned for this. I have here all my grains ready to mix in with it. I'm going to let that water drop in temperature a little bit. I don't want the grains to hit 170 degree water. I'd really rather it be at about 175 degree Fahrenheit. Now all these numbers have come out of my recipe, and the recipes are available online, from books, plenty of places to find that information. I didn't have to invent it. I planned ahead. We'll help that water move over. Also transfer my digital thermometer now. And my thermometer is telling me the temperature in that container is about 163 degrees Fahrenheit, which is great. When I add the grains, it should drop into the 150s if everything's ideal. In that 150 degree range, I'll have the enzymes able to start breaking apart the carbohydrates into sugars. There we go, that's all of our water. And then I'll add the grains. Again, a little planning with a recipe ahead of time helped me pick the grains. The beer I wanted to brew today is an American ale. I'd like it to be fairly low in alcohol, the sort of beer that you can drink on a spring day playing outside and not worry about having too much while you're out in the sun. And just as hoped, we're at 153 degrees Fahrenheit. My mash is ready to rest. I'm gonna let it rest for 45 minutes while those enzymes do their job, breaking down the carbohydrates into sugars that the yeast will be able to turn into alcohol later. I'm gonna put a lid on it to help maintain that temperature, and we'll let it rest for a while. That's the mash. Now you notice we've changed the setup a little bit now. I have at the top a tank full of sparge water. It's water that's been heated to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm gonna use that water to wash the sugar out of my mash tun. Remember, this is our mash. It's our grains that have steeped in here for just a little over 45 minutes at 153 degrees Fahrenheit. It smells like sugary bread or cinnamon roll. It's so sweet because it's all just sugar that's come out of the carbohydrates. The enzymes have broken down those carbohydrates into sugars, and now we're ready to turn that into beer. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use the husks and the grain as a filter. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let this water run through here into the mash, and then the hot liquor, that sugared mash, is gonna come out here. Now we call that wort, W-O-R-T. It's a sugary solution that we can ferment. At first, I'll get some small particles through there, so I'll have to run it through a couple times while the grain bed settles and becomes a filter. Then eventually it'll become more clear and I'll be able to start collecting it. I've got a pitcher in here that I'll use for collecting the first few runs, just to make sure it comes through all clear before we start. After taking the first couple liters of wort and running it back through the mash, where the grain can act as a filter, we're now getting a nice clear wort through, but not a whole lot of particle filter. It has a reddish color because of the grains I chose, but I can still see the bottom of the brew kettle beneath the liquid, which is a good indication I'm not getting a whole lot of extra particulate. So far so good. Now this is a slow process. We're barely trickling out of there, and we're barely trickling water in the top. Now we need to get 6 gallons through here. We'll be at this for a little while. I've used all the sparge water, 5 gallons of that, and I started with 2.5 gallons of water in my mash here. During the sparge process, I'm hoping to gather 6 gallons total. There's still a little bit trickling out. It's mostly clear and colorless, so it's a good sign. And if I've done my job right, these spent grains at the end are going to be bland, not have much flavor to them, because all of the sugar should have been washed down there. Yeah, there's no sweetness to it at all. They're just, spent grains. It's good roughage. Kind of bland though. I'm really looking forward to the wort. It's got a lot of sugar in it, and if I'm right, I'll have about 6 gallons that I can set to boil.
The hops we'll be using for today's brew have been ground and compressed into pellet form. We'll be adding some at the start of the boil. Some of them go in at about 20 minutes remaining, others at 15, and then the last of the hops we put in during secondary fermentation. The timing of when we add them determines whether those hops are going to affect the flavor of the beer or the aroma of the beer. When adding the hops, we add them carefully. As they dissolve, each little point on the hops becomes a nucleation point that could cause a boil over. Once all the hops have been added, we let it finish boiling. When the wort's been boiled, we need to cool it with an immersion cooler.
Really want to know the alcohol by volume, the ABV of this beer. Now right now there's no alcohol in it, there's just sugar. So what I'm going to do, from my sanitizer solution here, I'm going to take my beer thief, I'm going to take a small sample of it. I'll be able to measure the specific gravity of the beer, and I'll be able to compare that to the specific gravity when I bottle it, and that change will tell me how much sugar has been converted into alcohol. So I use my beer thief, draw a little bit of the solution up, put it into the cup, just enough to work with, not enough to miss out on later. Now I'm ready for my sanitized sample of yeast. Now this is a West Coast ale. Yeast come in different varieties, each one producing its own unique flavors. I'm going to pour it directly into my fermenter. You can see closely, you can not only hear the neighbor dogs, you can hear the spring peepers. It's been a long day out here. I took the yeast out of the refrigerator this morning, so it's had plenty of time to come back to room temperature and for the yeast to start digesting the little bit of sugar that was left in there with it. Now, in order to keep this sealed and safe, I'm going to need an airlock. You can see the airlock at the top. It allows carbon dioxide to escape without letting the outside air, which does carry wild yeast, back into the fermenter. Now the hard part, the waiting. It's been 2 weeks since I first brewed, and as you can see, a lot's changed. We've got a protein layer left at the top and a little bit of sediment at the bottom as the yeast has expended its life cycle. We've converted sugar into alcohol, and I'm just about ready to move this from our primary fermenter into a secondary fermenter to wait some more hops for just another week to allow the yeast to finish its job and allow those last little hops to influence the flavor of the overall beer. After that, we could bottle it or keg it. Been a success so far. Thanks for joining me.